Whoa! All right, everybody, welcome to this giant video essay. It really kind of spiraled into this huge thing, and I'm very excited to share it with you. Quick disclaimer before kicking this thing off. I spent a lot of time working on it. It was actually something that I recorded 2 months ago at this point. Since then, I've been stuck editing it when not working on the farm, at local farmers markets, doing construction on the temporary loft where we're staying, or building the TU studio. More on that at the end of this video, much less keeping the What's Right and Why Left podcasts going with Ann and Benjamin, while at the same time teaching my course and seminar and attending Nina and Benjamin's courses and Benjamin's seminar. So it's been a lot. It's been a lot of things going on at the same time that I'm also trying to learn Greek and guitar and jujitsu. And, it's just the way I like to live. I love doing a lot of things, and there are definite shortcomings to juggling so many things, such as things falling off or by the wayside, and then certain things not getting completed. But as Benjamin says, let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So I'm happy to leave this at the 80% point instead of getting lost in another couple months of trying to fix the remaining 20% of this video essay that need to be fixed. So yeah, at this point, I care more about continuing those other projects that I just referenced than I do about being a perfectionist. So I accept it warts and all, and expect that if you stick around, you do too. I also want to say thank you to all of the collaborators. And about the collaborators, I have a disclaimer. The over 20 guest appearances from different people reading quotes throughout this video essay is actually awesome. I really am so honored to have had so many collaborators reading quotes throughout this thing. But it goes without saying, or at least it should go without saying, that they don't necessarily agree with me, right? It should go without saying, but one of the things I spent about a month waiting for was the plastic pills quote that he was going to read. But when he finally got around to it, he disagreed with the quote. He didn't want to read something that he disagreed with. And so I ran into that with a few other people as well. But in a couple of those cases, they read it anyway. Like my dad is featured in this video essay. He ended up reading it anyway, even though he disagreed with it. But Pills didn't want to read the quote that Matthew Stanley ends up reading. And so, I asked him to read the Baudrillard quote instead because I figured he'd like that one more. But then he didn't respond. And I spent a couple weeks just kind of like in limbo, like, is he going to do it? Because it matters. In the theory scene, these kind of collaborations with big people, they matter. But at the end of the day, maybe it's for the best, because at the end of this is a critique of postmodernism in a sort of sense, not of the postmodern conditions, but of people who embrace and take for granted and then reify and do not look to go beyond those conditions. And at the end of the day, that is something that Plastic Pills does. So I don't care. I mean, I don't think that means that he's less of a good person. It would have been fun if we could have done that, but it's okay. J-Reg read that quote by Baudrillard, so it's going to be okay. Got a lot of really, really awesome people who read quotes. Some of them you'll know. Other people are just collaborators here at TU, participants, members, students who are on the subscriber side. So lots of really great stuff. Very excited. Anyway, they don't all agree with me. Most of them did not require that I agree or that they agree with me. My dad disagrees with me and the quote, but he read it nonetheless. And so props to Dad, and thank you. Like I said, truly an honor for everybody who does appear in this. So yeah, with that said, I hope you will enjoy. It's common to hear fans of French theory say postmodernism isn't really a thing, that people like Jordan Peterson are overblowing their claims, that postmodern theory isn't really the nihilistic kind of thing it gets framed as, etc. But there has to be a baby in that bathwater, right? Or at least I'm going to assert that there is. My sense is that both structuralist and post-structuralist thinkers do come off as both relativistic and nihilistic, at least in their transmission, which is to say the way they are picked up and employed by people in the existing academy or theory scene. They get stuck in language and don't believe we can really get at things, which is to say the matters themselves. They dispense with the notion of approximating ideals as coordinating principles for large-scale structural change. They get caught up in the politics of identity or its critique, of representation or its critique, and most noxious perhaps, especially through Deleuze and Guattari or Marcuse, they take the side of liberating desire. That's problematic for me because my position is that large-scale structural change will require going beyond such things. What we need is to instead sacrifice both pleasure and freedom for something greater. I'm not saying that everybody has to do this same amount of sacrifice, but the kind of project I'm involved in does require a great deal of that, while a lot of people seem to just be here doing a sort of tourism at the end of history. So maybe this isn't fair. I don't think that this can truly be attributed to Derrida or Foucault or Deleuze, each one of whom can skirt these critiques in various ways if we really try. But should we really try? Do any of them ever really steelman any of the things that they critique? No, they strike out on their own. And what I'm going to be doing in this video essay is striking out to say what I think. Welcome to the first video essay that I've made in 5 years. This is where I'm at. And I think it's something that will be beneficial for everybody, but also for me, just to get off my chest. Because I've spent a lot of time in the last few years sort of taking a backseat on this channel, propping other people up, interviewing a million people, and bringing on tons of guest lecturers. Now, of course, I've done lots of stuff on my own, but I haven't really put out an essay, you know? I think it's time. What follows is about nature, nurture, and natality, the 3 N's, and how this sets up for a new vision of soul-soil cycles and T3 institutions. What does all that mean? It means a new way of thinking, a new approach to theory and practice, and a fundamental critique of the existing theory scene. Let's go. Now, I love me some postmodern thinkers, but I'm not a postmodernist. Postmodernism is for people who belong to, presuppose, reify, and reproduce the global urban monoculture, particular to a phase of consumer finance capital. It's a particular kind of liberal subjectivity. Now, this is not something isolated to people who live in cities, and it's not something isolated to people who identify as liberals. This would include a lot of leftists and conservatives, a lot of atheists and Christians. What I'm trying to say is the general mode is one that buys into and reproduces certain tenets of 1990s liberalism, which is pretty much like a whatever floats your boat, you do you, we all have our own truths, truth is relative, or it assumes that because there is no foundation for reasonable discourse, that you have to make an absolutist claim to knowledge on the basis of, say, tradition or superstition. So I'm including both sides of the political aisle and people who would reject the term. Something I'll say later in this video essay is that postmodernism is real if it's just describing our current situation. But even then, it fails in its description because there are things that we can do to get outside of our situation, and more importantly, to get beyond language and meaning being something dependent on the slippage of signifiers that point at each other but ultimately lose grasp of anything real. It all falls into the same thing. Beyond the explicit level of belief, there is the actual lifestyle And leftists especially will take up this no ethical consumerism under capital approach. Yes, oh, capital, it's destroying everything, but no ethical consumerism under capitalism. Oh, so we don't have to live ethical lives so long as capital is outside of Pandora's box, when it's also very unlikely capital can be put back in its box. How convenient. How convenient if you really just want to do you and not really have to get after it and get your hands dirty and get to work. The kind of getting to work that I have in mind has nothing to do with a mundane job or a consumer life driven career, but is the kind of work that is fulfilling and that matters. It is the tending to and cultivating of both soil and souls, and bringing both into a kind of balance with natural cycles. Soul-soil cycles. Let's go. Now, this is something that I've been developing in the background at TU, but it might come off as a bit of a surprise for people who had me pegged as some kind of neo-Marxist, feminist, postmodernist, or whatever, because, well, I used to identify as one. As you can see in this footage, and a lot of people have seen it, I think over 326,000 people saw me, in reference to Jordan Peterson, saw me saying this.
I just wish that he would engage with the people that he spends so much time writing off, the scary postmodern feminist neo-Marxists, where he's basically taken everything he doesn't like in the world, put it all together, and then said that, it's them, right? Well, NSP is the postmodern feminist neo-Marxist here at Boise State.
Well, as evidenced by the fact that I was wearing a dress in that video, and I had a bow in my hair and lipstick on my lips, I was obviously in a different sort of phase of life there. That was in 2018, so that was 7 years ago. That was a couple of years after my Bernie Bro activism. I was operating under the belief that gender queering was the future of overcoming some of the obstacles that we had faced. Also thought that it was a radical form of culture jamming, and that, you know, if it's a social construct, challenge it and use that challenge to expose the imbecility of the opposition. And in that way, I was participating in a dumb kind of dialectic that occurs between the two sides of the culture war. So this essay is going to, in a sort of sense, correct the record for people who have had me pegged since then as some kind of postmodernist constructivist, okay? And it's a product of the research that I've done since then, especially since my burnout in 2020. So yeah, in setting the record straight, I really want to take on the idea that just because culture is socially constructed, we can therefore construct it any which way we please without any serious thought or concern for nature, for the tendencies naturally inherent in the world. No, I believe that there are absolute earthbound truths about human nature, truths about nature itself. Now, I mean, this is very passé from the standpoint of a 1970s wannabe radical theorist and the kinds of people who live in the safe little bubbles created by the bad faith theory of those times. Kinds of academics who want to justify never doing anything except for reading books and teaching, and ultimately just living as bureaucrats. But there are things about nature that are not only true, but also good. Now, nature can also be indifferent and cruel, and it's a sort of crucible of misery.
Oh, God. I love you. I love you, and I don't understand.
So, you know, this is not to homogenize and romanticize nature, but But at the same time, the pain of nature, of natural cycles, the aching, brittle, bone-breaking cold of winter, the death of winter, the death of the animals that have to be eaten, that feed on each other. This kind of pain is the condition of all the good things, right? And so supreme pessimists like Arthur Schopenhauer will say, oh, well, yeah, but all of the pleasure of the cheetah is canceled out by the pain of the gazelle.
The pleasure in this world, it has been said, outweighs the pain, or at any rate, there is an even balance between the two. If the reader wishes to see shortly whether this statement is true, let him compare the respective feelings of two animals, one of which is engaged in eating the other.
I don't think that's true. I think that gazelle had an overall good life. I think that cheetah is having a fantastic life as it eats the gazelle. And that pain is relatively momentary. Some of the big realizations that have come from my last decade of trying to organize with people and do theory and really pursue the question about the good life. One of the biggest ones is that pleasure and freedom are these sort of sacred cows, these idols that people worship. But there are much more important things than pleasure or freedom. Meaningful, which is to say fulfilling lives, are not lives spent pursuing satisfaction, but are rather lives sacrificed for something more important. You take the individuality, egoism, self, the Stirner, the Ayn Rand, and you put that on the altar of the future. Lee Edelman says, fuck the child, fuck the future. We want freedom and pleasure now.
Fuck the social order and the child in whose name we are collectively terrorized. Fuck Annie. Fuck the waif from Les Mis. Fuck the poor, innocent kid on the net. Fuck laws, both with capital L's and small. Fuck the whole network of symbolic relations and the future that serves as its prop.
This quote comes from one of the foundational texts of queer theory, and it's meant to be provocative, but I think it might go a little too far. I'm actually tempted to turn it right back around onto Edelman and say, well then, fuck you, dude. But I'm not gonna do that, because that would be rude. And I'm going to proceed to take the high ground here and present a more positive image of how things work and the kind of social change that I care about. And though I want to take a more positive route, I might as well just say though, yeah, I am swimming upstream here. In the theory scene today, it is normal to take edgy, antagonistic positions that are really only antagonistic or edgy towards the perceived mainstream or middle that isn't really, by the way, legitimate. There really is no such thing anymore. The middle is gone. It's just a bunch of fringes and niches, and everybody has their idea of a mainstream, but you know, here we are. It's the post-class fractured mass, and reality is in question, without a doubt. We are in postmodern times, but that doesn't mean we have to give in. And the worst kind of giving in is giving in to this sort of, oh, it's all just your opinion, and the kind of leveling of qualitative distinction that flattens human life and empowers a self-annihilating death loop.
I am a nihilist. I observe, I accept, I assume, I analyze the second revolution, that of the 20th century, that of postmodernity, which is the immense process of the destruction of meaning, equal to the earlier destruction of appearances. If being a nihilist is carrying to the unbearable limit of hegemonic systems, this radical trait of derision and of violence, this challenge that the system is summoned to answer through its own death, then I am a terrorist and nihilist in theory, as the others are with their weapons. Theoretical violence, not truth, is the only resource left to us.
That's what I'm getting at when I call something postmodern. It's not just the conditions. Sure, the conditions are postmodern. We have to be realists about the conditions. But it's the people who assume and reify or reproduce that situation. Those who take up great theorists to promote their sort of relativistic, nihilistic approach. These people will use desire and death drive to flatten everything meaningful, such as the distinction between satisfaction and fulfillment.
Bullshit!
That's where we get this kind of postmodern nihilistic sophistry that is really just a brand of hyper niche, self-conceited consumerism that reduces all qualitative distinctions into, oh, well, that's just your opinion. That's just your opinion, right? And we'll do so by recourse to the fact that, well, people disagree. Because the majority even might disagree. They want to say that they don't have to think seriously about what you're saying. And it's not just you or me. They will do this sort of cross comparison in their mind against a human average that they reduce all of us to. Because there are other people with other opinions, they think that they can write yours off. Instead of like, oh, who are you to judge? It should be, oh, you're judging. Let's see how good your judgment is compared to the person who just uses cheap ways out from having to exercise their discernment or take serious positions that require judgment.
Judgment, to be valid, must be exercised with others. It is not a solitary act, but a communicative one. To judge is to take a stand in the world, to say, this is so, or this is not so, and in doing so, to risk being wrong. Judging is one of the most important activities in which this sharing the world with others comes to pass. The faculty of judging particulars, as Kant teaches us, is that mysterious endowment of the mind by which we are able to distinguish between right and wrong, beautiful and ugly, without the aid of general rules.
And if you're not taking responsibility to do that, then it's really seductive to go for this, oh, well, you know, lots of people disagree with that approach that you'll notice is very popular. Now, to be sympathetic, of course people are going to go like that when they are structurally stultified of their time energy. When there are not large energy-infused repeatable blocks of time socially available, people are exhausted, defensive, competitive. They need their little ways out from having to think seriously about things. And so they go for these cheap kind of write-offs. From my standpoint, the problem is that this approach, though something I can easily be sympathetic to, becomes a part of a death loop that working people get stuck in, especially those who are most critical, trying to think outside the box. We get so bogged down in this kind of thinking, and it becomes a terrible trap. I love all of the kinds of theorists that I've mentioned here. I really, really do. But I just loathe the way that they get taken up and how they grease the gears of a self-defeating feedback loop that undermines individual and collective opportunities to make something better possible. I have spent the last decade tarrying with all these different kinds of perspectives and being more self-critical than I am of my interlocutors. Now, if you think otherwise, you haven't been paying attention. I've been extremely self-critical to the point where I don't really allow myself to believe things, to really take up positions. And that's convenient too. There's a kind of agnosticism that is like a weasel way out of having to truly tarry with disagreements, tensions, or one's fundamental hunches, right? Now, I don't think you should take your hunches as gospel truths, but you should take them seriously. Well, at this point though, I'm done being too overly self-critical. Other people can do that for me. And other people who want to genuinely engage in critique can do so by writing very thoughtful sort of essays, which is why I've started turning off the comments section, is because it gives people this sort of feeling of community, this feeling of cultivating some kind of dialogue, when in reality, I have no idea who you are just because you come out of the comments section. It doesn't matter. Like, you have to write me something heartfelt and thought out that seriously engages with my work. Otherwise, I'll just say, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know who you are. I'm going to move on. Right? This is not a public square down there. There's a lot of people who think that the comment section is the agora. This has been a repeated issue. It's not the agora. It gives you the feeling of an agora, and so you never actually have to get off your couch or toilet and go out and make an agora. No, you've got it in the comment section. Well, now Theory Underground was part of a 5-year project to run myself through a variety of lines of research necessary to set myself up to write a book to the parents of the kids who will be 25 and 30 years, as I laid out in the introduction of my first book, Waypoint, published in 2020.
Most of us are not yet born. By us, I mean working thinkers and thinking workers. Whether you got to go to college for a short break from work, or worked your way through college, or never went, but have supplemented your conceptual toolkit via video, podcasts, blogs, and audiobooks online, when off of work or on the clock, you and I are only just getting started. We are not going anywhere. A way of saying this all with theory jargon, the working class is only just beginning to acquire the conditions necessary to go from merely being an exploited class existing in itself to one that is going to exist for itself. In simpler terms, we exist, but we still mostly lack the means to use reality to our advantage. For now, we only exist as means towards the self-interested ends of others, profit serving capital.
When I say most of us are yet to be born, I am proposing that those of us attempting to balance the life of the mind with the work of the hands have almost always been rare and isolated. The internet and audio access that make books, blogs, and podcasts available to some of us while working has resulted in our numbers growing, and we are beginning to connect with one another. Those connections lay the basis upon which to build an organic intellectual milieu.
For those of us finding ourselves here, it is on us to lay the groundwork for those to come. To that end, I am giving myself the next 5 years to develop before writing a very specific book to the parents of the children who will be 25 in 30 years. I will then be writing and developing course materials for those working thinkers and thinking workers who will be 25 in 30 years.
Why say 25 and 30 years? Because since I agree with Rosenstock's black pill take about the current state of the American working class, I'm not writing to it in its current state so much as giving myself 5 years to write to the parents of my intended audience who will be postgraduate age by the time I am actually ready to write the books and develop the courses necessary for the next generational bloom of organic intellectuals.
While I think the longer-term approach makes sense as a practical way of thinking about things, it also gives me a definite way of thinking forward and building my projects in a way that breaks out of the trap of perpetual immediacy that infantilizes us all in a consumer society. Long-term planning is one of the antidotes to immaturity, and I think something to begin doing if I want to make any kind of lasting contribution.
With the 5 years of effort that I've put into Theory Underground, I've been able to bring on some of the most amazing professors, thinkers, and theorists from the theory scene, either through interviews, epic marathon live streams, or actual courses as guest lecturers or visiting professors at Theory Underground. And that's been a lot of fun, and I've learned a lot. And I've also taught courses while doing all of that. But one of the things that I've really failed to dig into is the nature, nurture, natality, N3, as we call it, thread. It's like a buried lead that has been present for anyone paying attention for the last couple of years. But a lot of that was on the back end. A lot of that was in the seminars. In the near future, I planned on releasing a couple of the episodes that I've done with Anne, especially a lecture session that we did as the conclusion of the critical media theory and the critical doxology and Timenergy cohorts. Our seminars that we were doing culminated in this lecture we did on nature, nurture, and natality last October. Conceptualizing it this way, the 3 N's, or the green boxes I've called it elsewhere, gets at something otherwise left out of almost all intellectual or theoretical endeavors, especially in the theory scene today. So what is nature? What is nurture? What is natality? Natality, we'll start with that one, is the opposite of being unto death. It's being unto birth. It's the bringing into existence of the new. It's the radical space of freedom opened up by grace and forgiveness. It's the sort of blank slate that every child brings into existence.
Birth is humanity's greatest underexplored subject. Birth has long hovered in death's shadow, quietly performing its under-recognized labor. What, I've wondered, would human life look like if the philosopher's mortal instructions, questions, and observations were imagined in reverse, and if the poets, sages, intellectuals, and political leaders had made statements more like these? From the time we are born, we are being shaped by birth. Study birth always. It takes an entire lifetime to learn how to give birth or to come to terms with our having been born. The great philosophers are those who practice being born and birthing. Keep birth daily before your eyes. Birth is evidence of our freedom. The fundamental purpose of art is to process the strange, painful, and miraculous experience of childbirth. Saints and messiahs, revolutionaries and inventors, artists and queens, they'd all be seen as people who once were born. We may die alone, but we were never born alone, a fact that would remain obvious. All human individuality is relative. Our births were made possible by other people and were conditioned by the material world we arrive in, a world that is materially altered by our births. We exist in relation to the natural world, not in transcendence of it, and while we are agents in our lives, we are never really masters. Humans are fundamentally natal creatures. We'd remind one another, and throughout our lives, we will be forced, whether we like it or not, to wrestle with our own natality.
Now, the child is the primordial instantiation of natality, just as pregnancy is the primordial instantiation of potency or potential. One of my favorite thinkers on this line of thought is Emmanuel Levinas. He's one of my big 3 thinkers, in fact. I take him to be one of the most important corrective measures against some of the worst tendencies in both Karl Marx and Martin Heidegger's work. Levinas, in his thinking about the child, tends to get underestimated or simplified and then critiqued or written off, especially by people like Simone de Beauvoir or Luce Irigaray. And that's, maybe fair in a certain time and place within a certain wave of feminist theory. But I don't think anyone that I've ever encountered has seriously tarried with what he has to say about natality. Of course, you won't find the word natality in the work of Levinas. The translation of the word that comes closest is what he calls fecundity, which is the phenomenon of us human beings in our fullness producing or bringing forth new life that is us and is not us, and it goes beyond us.
The I is at the same time this engagement and this disengagement, and in this sense time, drama in several acts. Without multiplicity and discontinuity, without fecundity, the I would remain a subject in which every adventure would revert into the adventure of a fate. A being capable of another fate than its own is a fecund being. In paternity, where the I, across the definitiveness of an inevitable death, prolongs itself in the other, time triumphs over old age and fate by its discontinuity. The profanation that violates a secret does not discover, beyond the face, another more profound I which this face would express. It discovers the child. By a total transcendence, the transcendence of transubstantiation, the I is, in the child, an other. Paternity remains a self-identification, but also a distinction within identification, a structure unforeseeable in formal logic. My child is a stranger, but a stranger who is not only mine, for he is me.
But obviously there's also powerful metaphorical resonances here, and we could talk about natality in a variety of other ways. 2 of the most influential and powerful thinkers from the history of humanity to think deeply about natality, one of whom actually coined the term, Hannah Arendt and Friedrich Nietzsche. Arendt's the one who coined the term, by the way. These two are noteworthy because though they thought so much about it, both of them died childless. That childlessness could have freed them up to think deeply about these things. But that could be a sort of Fichtean anstos, meaning what made it possible for them to think about these things simultaneously corrupted their ability to think about these things. How many philosophers were good parents? How many good parents really can think nature, nurture, and natality? Within any population, there's a statistically reliable portion of the population that is likely to going to have children. And most people even want children. In fact, most people will find rearing children to be the most fulfilling aspect of their lives. But there's always going to be a minority of people for whom that is not fulfilling, or not even a genuine calling. Or they might feel the pull towards having children and bringing them up in this world, but choose to sacrifice that for some other end. Traditionally, such people went to monasteries. They joined the church. They became a part of the priest class. And they served humanity. They served the universal. They lived their lives as models for those who needed inspiration and uplift. This is where I have to bring in Christopher Lasch. In particular, his books, The Culture of Narcissism, his book on the family, Haven in a Heartless World, and The Revolt of the Elites were pretty influential on me, I think, over the last 5 years. So what's Christopher Lasch ultimately getting at? Let me give you a quick little summary before bringing in a couple of quotes. Basically, he's going to say that the new elites, which include not only corporate managers, but the whole array of professional experts, have little use for the family or for other traditional institutions that once anchored social life. They see these as impediments to the individual's pursuit of self-fulfillment, which they define in terms of career success and personal gratification. This is where we bring in the therapeutic sensibility, which is championed by the professional classes, which encourages a preoccupation with self that undermines the solidarity of family and community, values once central to working class life. So instead of mutual dependence, the PMC promotes a view of relationships as instrumental to personal growth. The rise of the new class of experts has coincided with a contempt for the backwardness of ordinary people, whose loyalty to family, neighborhood, and religion is seen as an obstacle to progress. This class promotes a culture of self-awareness that celebrates the unencumbered individual, free from the burdens of tradition, or as Michelle Garner from OG Rose said in our recent conversation on What's Right,
way of understanding like motherhood and fatherhood and making a family, because you're entangling yourself so much, and that's wonderful and amazing, because guess what, roots entangle into the ground, and that's why you have these gorgeous plants that can bear fruit and vegetables, but it's also like that entanglement is risky, right? Because it's our hearts and our minds and little beings and their hearts and their minds, and it's like it's scary, because what ifs, right? What if?
People are risk averse, afraid of entanglement, afraid of heartbreak, afraid of human complexity, and obviously poverty, because ours is a society that says that poverty is just what you deserve if you choose to have children before the age of 30. So people become casual daters. They try to have as few strings attached as possible, and relationships become a sort of tit for tat. My pleasure and freedom has to be equaled out to your pleasure and freedom, and then we're taking turns having our pleasure and freedom instead of both partners dedicating themselves to something greater than themselves. The revolt of the elites, or this rebel priest class as I'm calling it, this misanthropic, narcissistic, consumerist, radical, individualistic approach that is so attractive when you are in your younger to mid-20s. This approach it scorns family ties and entanglement. It projects its own experience and preferences onto everyone else, and in so doing has lost most people who obviously at some point will want to have families.
Without intending to, the managerial and professional elite ruling class has created new forms of illiteracy, even in the act of setting up a system of universal education. It has undermined the family while attempting to rescue the family. It has torn away the veil of chivalry that once tempered the exploitation of women and has brought men and women face to face as antagonists. It has expropriated the worker's knowledge of his craft and the mother's instinct for childbearing, and has reorganized this knowledge as a body of esoteric lore accessible only to the initiated. The new ruling class has elaborated new patterns of dependence, as effectively as its bourgeois forebears eradicated the dependence of the peasant on his lord, the apprentice on his master, and the woman on her man.
Today, we have a rebel priest class. Instead of thinking natality and uplifting those who are engaged in its primordial form, this rebel priest class is anti-natalist.
But kids, all of my friends who have kids are in hell. I actually don't know anyone who's like happy and has children.
Scorns the very notion of family, or tells people that poverty is their own fault if they have children, right? And so monks and nuns, they're supposed to be models, like they're supposed to be living models, sacrifices. They're supposed to say, instead of having literal children, I'm going to have spiritual children, because I'll be an influencer on the people who are raising the real children. But thanks to Nietzsche, of course, I'm just using him as a metonym for a broader tendency, there is this sort of radical, misanthropic, narcissistic, solipsistic, individualist, consumer, bohemian, creative way of striking away from and resenting the common person. Instead of living a life that can be genuinely modeled by most people, they live special snowflake lives that most people could never model without it leading to misery.
The emergence of the narcissistic personality reflects, among other things, a drastic shift in our sense of historical time. Narcissism emerges as the typical form of character structure in society that has lost interest in the future. Under these conditions, the thought of our eventual supersession and death becomes utterly insupportable and gives rise to attempts to abolish old age and to extend life indefinitely. When men find themselves incapable of taking an interest in earthly life after their own death, they wish for eternal youth for the same reason they no longer care to reproduce themselves. When the prospect of being superseded becomes intolerable, parenthood itself, which guarantees that it will happen, appears almost as a form of self-destruction.
This must be overcome. This is why I just can't stand it anymore. When I am talking about the general rules for being human in a civilization, and people turn that conversation, which is a conversation about ethics, into a conversation about their personal lives, their autobiographies, about why the general rule doesn't apply to them. And it's like, yeah, I get it. You're here. So am I. Insofar as we're here, we are exceptions to these general rules in a variety of ways. That doesn't mean that we're such exceptional people that we need to just dispense with thinking about how these ideas, ethical ways of life, have to work for most people, right? Most people are going to be parents. Most people are going to want to raise children. Most people, I would say, need to. Being childless for most people results in a kind of isolation and slow death and perpetual immaturity. Right? That doesn't mean that everyone has to have kids, but it does mean that this sort of dink or sink, right? Dual income, no kids, no children, or sink, single income, no children, that either one of those can be the model for most humanity. That's crazy, right? So natality highlights the fact that bringing life into existence is a noble thing, that it's actually the most primordial source for the new, for grace and forgiveness, and for radical immanent critique.
The miracle that saves the world, the realm of human affairs, from its normal, natural ruin, is ultimately the fact of natality, in which the faculty of action is ontologically rooted. With each birth comes the possibility of a new beginning, the capacity to start something new, to act in ways that are not predetermined. The new beginning inherent in birth can make itself felt in the world only because the newcomer possesses the capacity of beginning something anew, that is, of acting.
It is the primordial form of immanent critique, something that comes from within you and will sublate you and then go beyond you in a way that you cannot control. Right? Like, that is powerful. Powerful. And people who shy away from it are usually people who never grow up. But there are those of us who will never have kids. We have to be there for the people who are having the kids. Quick point of clarification, I don't mean people who accidentally have kids. Right? I'm talking about people who are deliberately going out of their way to build a life for the future, for future generations, to love, nurture, care for that next generation in the only way that a parent can, right? I'm not talking about these people who are having kids because they think that they should or because it was an accident. I'm talking about people who are called to do this. I'm talking about people who are doing it because there is something more important than pleasure or freedom, which we'll come back to. We've covered a lot, and we're only halfway through this thing. Most of what we've been doing has been this focus on natality. Natality is the bringing into existence of the new, whereas nurture is how we mediate nature. I won't go so much into child rearing and education as nurture, which obviously that counts, but I'm going to instead turn to the juncture between nurture and nature that is agriculture, and how agriculture is the basis of culture. Regenerative agriculture is going to be one of my main sort of touchstones here that I really want to drive home as a critique of postmodernism and postmodern culture. Right? This whole approach that says it's all language and signifiers pointing at other it's language all the way down, and so it's just meaning just based on signifiers. All of this is missing. There are earth-bounded truths rooted in the tendencies of nature that can be harnessed or countered, but we counter them too much and we burn out. And if we harness them too much, we burn out. So a quick aside about postmodernism. Postmodernism, I should have said this earlier and I might have touched on it, but I just need to really drive it home. Otherwise people will watch part of this essay and then run around talking about it as though I said something I didn't. Postmodernism is our actual situation, and we have to be realists about it. Baudrillard is correct about the way things work at the level of culture today. People who are ideologically postmodernist, though, are simply giving in to those current conditions. They're being realists in a sort of sense about the current situation, but because they are doing that, I think that they trap themselves and others in self-defeating loops that grease the gears of our nihilistic postmodern condition. to go beyond that, we have to assert these things that are real, timeless, true, good, just, and beautiful. My way to do that is by focusing on natality, nurture, and nature. To start with that, I think everybody should watch these 2 documentaries. Just go search online, pay for them if you have to. I promise it's worth your money. One of them is available, I think, on Hulu or Prime or something like that for free. The other, I'm not sure, but don't worry about that. Just watch these no matter what. The first is called Common Ground.
What I'm about to tell you is a matter of life and death.
Facts have been proven. Roundup does cause cancer.
If you burrow deeply enough, there is a pipeline of money from the pesticide industry into those universities. They're getting the kind of science that money can buy.
Nature is the mother of us all. And if mama ain't happy, we're
But there's a way to save our precious soils. It's called regeneration.
Regeneration is not just restoring the land to the state that we found it at, but actually making it better.
We have added over 96 tons of carbon per acre into our soil. Can we mitigate climate change? Absolutely.
The second documentary I want you to check out is called Joel Salatin, the Lunatic Farmer.
You're called a lunatic, a bioterrorist, a con artist, a world-class bigot, and starvation advocate. What do you have to say for yourself?
What do I have to say for myself?
Next speaker will be Joel Salatin, who is a farmer, lecturer, and author.
He describes himself as an evangelical, Christian conservative, environmentalist, lunatic farmer.
He's kind of the godfather, not of just like homesteading, but of sustainable farming and a lot of these other practices that he's put into play.
Your approach to farming is so natural and so normal and so, in my opinion, non-controversial.
We were branded Luddites and anti-progressives, anti-science.
We got a knock on the door. You've been selling illegal meat, and we've confiscated it all. You know, Lord, if we lose this thing, what do you have in mind here?
It's never been like this. What happened? Regulatory, extortion, tyranny.
Them was the days.
Them was the days.
When I watch your method, it seems normal, it seems like common sense, it seems like old knowledge, but yet you're looked at as some sort of a wild man out there.
A lunatic.
These are 2 different approaches to the same situation, a situation where humanity has now for hundreds of years deviated so strongly from nature and nature's course and trying to live in harmony with nature and its courses, its cycles, that we're destroying ourselves and the planet, right? The leading causes of death are human caused, and they're not caused by simple neglect. They're caused by a pursuit of profit and short-term interests that are private as opposed to the good of everyone. Living in accordance with nature means 2 different things, though. Before I get back to these documentaries, quick little aside about it, I have to say, it can either mean that we live under a law imposed by nature's true essence, or it can mean nature has certain tendencies. We cannot just resist those tendencies without burning out or without it backfiring. But in fact, we have to counter and harness those tendencies strategically. And if we don't counter and harness those strategically, well then, we're really setting ourselves up for failure. Okay. In the first version of nature there, this one that's it's all about like essences and you're subject to the law of nature. That to me sounds extremely convenient for ideologies that serve the interests of whoever is mobilizing or employing those ideals. But the idea of having to strategically harness and counter tendencies of nature, tendencies in our own bodies, tendencies when it comes to the cycles of the flora and the fauna and the soil that subtends them. That is what matters, and that's what it means to be truly human. And it's in the noble sense of not living in harmony like, oh, we're all a bunch of hippies and nature's just this goddess mother who's so loving and smothers us in her love, and we're all on mushrooms all the time and we all just roll around and have orgies. No.
It's not okay to abuse animals. It doesn't mean that we don't eat them, because there can be no life without sacrifice. But what makes a sacrifice sacred is the honor and respect bestowed upon the sacrifice prior to slaughter. There's nothing sacred about slaughtering a Tyson chicken. That's just sacrilege. It's just putting it out of its misery. One of our chickens is out here at fresh air, sunshine, green grass, bugs, and not living in fecal particulate all the time. That becomes a sacred sacrifice because it has fully honored and respected the chickenness of the chicken.
We're talking about something that has pain, that has pleasure, but that the pain and pleasure is not the point. So bringing it back to these two documentaries, Common Ground and The Lunatic Farmer, what I like about it is that they're both responding to this same situation, where for hundreds of years now we have undermined the ability of most people to live in a way that is in accordance with nature in the second sense that I laid out, which is to say, there's a give and take. Instead, it's all been take, and reduced to plastic. Instead, it's all been take, and reduced to toxic sludge, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, the biggest killers.
The lobbyists, they want to make sure we're using as much pesticide and fertilizer and seed as they can possibly sell.
The farmers today, many of them are trying to only grow warm season crops, such as corn and soybeans.
What gets called traditional farming today is actually poisonous for us and the environment. Traditional farming, the kind that relies on heavy plowing, with tillage, with fertilizers, with pesticides. It's about extraction. It's not about caring and tending. It's about profit. It's not about cultivation.
So what we have here to my left, this is the neighbor's cropland field of soybeans, was eroded by wind. To the right here, this is my land. It's in perennial pasture. This is a shelter belt tree windbreak to protect the soil.
What I like about both of these documentaries is that they are critiques of traditional farming, as has been practiced in the United States, that provide a way forward that builds soil, gets us back into natural cycles, produces more food, better food, and is regenerative. Both of these documentaries, though they come from completely different ideological angles, are getting at the fact that building, caring for, tending, cultivating soil is a genuine calling, but not just a calling for farmers. It's a way of life for society. It's a way for us to relate to the earth, to our own bodies, and to one another.
So we move these pigs every 5 to 12 days through the paddocks. So they get their salad bar and they get their feed. And they get exercise. There's no smell, there's no flies. The pigs get to fully express their pigness. And in the confinement animal feeding operation, they're just confined in little slatted floor cells and high stress.
The way that we farm is a metaphor for the way that we school, for the way that we prison, for the way that we war. The way that we farm is not just a metaphor, though. Agriculture is the mirror of culture? No. Culture is the mirror of agriculture. For this, we need Wendell Berry, and to read his The Unsettling of America.
A culture is not a collection of relics or ornaments, but a practical necessity, and its corruption invokes calamity. A healthy culture is a communal order of memory, insight, value, work, conviviality, reverence, aspiration. It reveals the human necessities and the human limits. It clarifies our inescapable bonds to the earth and to each other. A culture cannot survive long at the expense either of its agricultural or of its natural sources. To live at the expense of the source of life is obviously suicidal. Though we have no choice but to live at the expense of other life, it is necessary to recognise the limits and dangers involved. Past a certain point in a unified system, other life is our own. The definitive relationships in the universe are thus not competitive, but interdependent, and from a human point of view they are analogical. We can build one system only within another. We can have agriculture only within nature, and culture only within agriculture. At certain critical points, these systems have to conform with one another or destroy one another.
There's a big difference between the conquistador who plunders and the human husbandry that brings tending, care, and concern to soil and the flora and fauna that constitutes an ecosystem capable of producing nutrient-dense, life-sustaining, and healing food.
The plant feeds carbon down into this fungal network, and in exchange, the fungi scavenge for resources in the soil like phosphorus and nitrogen, and then feed it to the plant roots.
This is not just farming, this is true religion.
The heart of the matter. You're aiming for food that truly nourishes, supports life, and even promotes healing. That's a fantastic goal. To give you the most
Shut up! Common Ground and The Lunatic Farmer are both responses to this situation. And both of them get at something very similar, which is the idea that one of the greatest errors in extractive agriculture is not just the mass scale specialization that we have been deceived into believing is necessary for producing enough food to maintain life on this planet, right? I can get into that. Those documentaries do get into that. But it's more importantly about how animals and plants have to live in a symbiotic relation to live out their essences, to allow the pigness of the pig to come through.
Pigs get to fully express their pigness.
Right? That pig cannot live a fulfilling life and make actually delicious and healthy, nutritious meat without being able to live out its purpose, which is to grub around root systems, thus making the trees and bushes more resilient. The pig has a function in the ecosystem, the same way that the chicken has a function in the ecosystem. The chicken's function is to follow behind livestock. Now, these kinds of livestock, or what we call livestock, they also have a function. They walk around, they till the earth, but it's soft tilling. It's not this super destructive kind of rototilling done by industrial man, or by the plow for that matter.
So this is the eggmobile, and it follows the cows. So the cows were here about 3-4 days ago, and the chickens follow the cows, and the chickens then scratch through these cow patties. They spread out the cow patties so it covers more ground, and they eat the fly larvae and parasites and things like that, and act as a biological sanitizer behind the cows. This is one of the most symbiotic relationships in nature, is the bird-herbivore relationship. And so all we're doing is we're mimicking that pattern, and that keeps the cows healthy, and it makes a wonderful, wonderful egg. And the chickens then are doing that work instead of us having to put the cows through the corral and shoot them up with things that make the meat so bad it kills all the bugs.
It helps build more resilient root systems that retain water and explode nutrient density. And of course, all of this facilitated by the mycelium, the sort of rhizomatic mushroom systems that are necessary conduits for everything in the soil, right? The soil that subtends the flora and the fauna is the most important part, but the mycelium is the internet of the soil, right? It makes it so that all of these creatures are able to live in symbiosis. And sometimes that means they eat each other. The livestock does the soft tilling. They're giant creatures and they kind of smash down the earth and they dig into it, and that builds these root systems. And they also eat and they tug at it, but they don't decimate it unless they are being contained in a system that Foucault would obviously point out mirrors the prisons and the schools.
What happens when the cow comes along, or the sheep or the goat, and they grab onto a plant and pull on it to eat, that plant has a response. And that response is, I need to put more photosynthate into my roots, so the next time I'm grabbed, I'm holding solid. It means CO2 out of the air into the plant, making carbohydrates and sugars that go into the soil, feeding the microbial population.
But if they're not being contained in CAFOs or CAFO, they're able to move. And if they're left in their sort of natural course, nature shows us across the whole planet, they will mob together in giant packs, right? This is a safer way for them to go. Predators will pick off of them over time, but they're just picking off the weaker ones for the most part. And these giant mobs that are grazing leave behind them this sort of soft-tilled soil that then birds come and they groom it, right? They pick out from it little bits and pieces, and then they return more fertilizer, right? They come through the cow pies, they pick them apart. What all of this does, builds soil. What extractive agriculture does is it reduces soil to dirt. Dirt is death. It's empty, it's hollow.
I really think that the vast majority, by that I mean 95+% of farmers and ranchers, they don't put their hands in the soil. They don't understand. It just makes me sick. It literally makes me sick to my stomach to see this.
Even if we usually take it for granted, we know that good soil is not just dirt. When you dig into fresh, rich earth, you can feel the life in it. Fertile soil crumbles and slides right off the shovel. Look closely and you'll find a whole world of life eating life, a biological orgy, recycling the dead back into new life. Healthy soil has an enticing and wholesome aroma, the smell of life itself. The twin problems of soil degradation and erosion have plagued humanity since the dawn of agriculture. Although these problems are mostly of our own making and well within our power to solve, citizens, the media, and politicians don't seem to take them as seriously as volatile financial markets, climate change, or any number of other societal challenges. And yet, how we treat the soil is fundamental to the health and survival of modern civilization.
Does your lifestyle produce pure waste, which is to say dirt, or does it, in its feedback loop, nurture and sustain and cultivate soil, and therefore happy plants and animals, the metonym for which is the earthworm?
Worms turn plant matter into soil. The more earthworms, the healthier your soil.
Earthworms are one of the major conduits between soil in its subterranean levels and the surface. Earthworms going down and up, they actually keep everything moving. Land without earthworms is land devoid of life. It's something much, much worse than a graveyard. It's a desolate wasteland. It's a desert in the making. It's desertification. It's runoff. It's dust bowls. Dirt is the erosion of civilizations.
With rare exceptions, the fields of all countries have been made to bear their crops without the least reference to the interests of future generations. With just a couple feet of soil standing between prosperity and desolation, civilizations that plow through their soil vanish. We are degrading and eroding the world's soils far faster than they form. We are running down our stock of fertile topsoil, the one thing we absolutely need to support civilization in the long run.
Now, Common Ground and The Lunatic Farmer as documentaries are both going to go into this, but one is from a sort of Christian evangelical friendly, more conservative and libertarian approach. The Lunatic Farmer, Joel Salatin, calls himself a conservative, he calls himself a capitalist, he calls himself a radical, he calls himself all these other things, as well as a farmer. And his polyphase farming technique is genuinely radical. It's one of the coolest things that has ever existed, right? Like, it's really good. But the thing is and Common Ground is going to be really good for this, it is, in a sort of sense, getting back to the way that indigenous inhabitants of the Americas were already living. The indigenous inhabitants of the Americas, for the most part, already knew about a lot of this. The forests were planted by the natives, and they were maintained by the natives. The forests should be thought of as extremely high-tech farms.
Permaculture has the saying, we need more forests and fewer trees. And we have to realize that the dense forests of North America are a European creation. The Native Americans didn't like dense forests because you can't see them. Somebody might sneak up on you. So they wanted not only open for safety, but it brought the bison and the elk and the birds and all that.
And in fact, the first Europeans who came to America wrote back in their diaries, they said, we could take a European continental army and march it from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi without any roads.
Instead of allowing nature to just come in and burn our messy forests and create huge problems for us, the natives were doing controlled burns of forests. And what Common Ground says is that new research is showing that the natives did not follow cattle and bison and buffalo. No, these mob beasts that till the soil followed the natives.
A lot of people say that we followed the buffalo. But there's increasing evidence that the buffalo followed our fire. Because in the wake of indigenous fire comes what? Nutrient-dense grasslands. Indigenous peoples have purposefully applied fire to this continent for tens of thousands of years, because you're actually recycling those nutrients from the expired grass tissues into ash, and that ash goes straight into minerals for the new plants to use. So you had your nut and your mast food source, and then you had open savanna, which would attract your protein relatives, which were deer, elk, and other ungulates. A lot of indigenous regenerative praxis is about creating a home for your food so that your food comes to you. It's about creating habitat. We should ensure that the original peoples of this land have a land base to do their practices. And so to me, regeneration, it's about healing history.
But what Common Ground gets at is like this whole settler, colonial, capitalist, angle. So, it's obviously not catering to this evangelical, libertarian, or conservative audience that the Lunatic Farmer is geared towards. No, Common Ground is for something else. Common Ground is for the progressive, for the person who's most concerned about climate change, for the person who is probably a lot more liberal, Both of these documentaries, though, are saying that the right way to harness and counter tendencies of nature is to, yes, have cows.
You don't have to eat them if you don't want to, but you can't ignore the fact of science, biology, and ecology.
But keep them close together and moving in a mob that stampedes the earth and keeps them going onto new terrain every day.
For millions of years, four-legged animals roamed the plains in tight herds, spreading seeds with their hooves and fertilizing soil with their dung and urine. Regenerative agriculture aims to bring those bovines back.
How do we get 80 to 50 feet of topsoil in places in the Midwest? We had 169 million ruminants running around the country that were grazing and moving and building soil. The animals are a critical part of the ecosystem of soil creation. You need animals to integrate into a regenerative agricultural system in order to restore soil.
They should be constantly moving, day after day, which is the natural way. You can't just take them away from soil and put them on concrete. That's insane. And then feed them corn. That's ridiculous, right? Chickens should follow cows. There's a natural symbiosis here. And so having the chickens follow the cows means having them follow in what you call, what is it called? Chicken tractors. That's what we called them when I was growing up. Chicken tractors. My mom's been a big fan of Joel Salatin my whole life.
We do 500 or 600 chickens a year as well with the portable pens a la Joel Salatin's great research. We've been doing that over 20 years, 25 years.
We feel that if we grow healthy earthworms, that the soil will be healthy for the plants. And if the plants are healthy, that people eating them will be healthy. So we never use any chemicals. If we ever have a pest problem, we simply cover it with insect netting or tear it out and plant again. But chemicals are not ever used on our soil because that would not produce healthy earthworms, and healthy earthworms are our goal.
I've met Joel Salatin, right? I've brought him out to speak at an event. He's a really cool guy. Both the Lunatic Farmer and Common Ground are getting at the same thing. Neither one of them really talks about the circuit of capital, the global crisis that is capital, or on the other side, the state, and how the state mirrors the worst aspects of capital, but in its attempts to counter the worst excesses of capital, tends to create new problems. Problems of bureaucratic glut, problems of top-down administration that are out of tandem with or out of touch with the local. And there's no book better for thinking about this than Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott.
Much of this book can be read as a case against the imperialism of high modernist, planned social order. I stress the word imperialism here because I am emphatically not making a blanket case against either bureaucratic planning or high modernist ideology. I am, however, making a case against an imperial or hegemonic planning mentality that excludes the necessary role of local knowledge and know-how.
James C. Scott is here developing a line of critique against high modernism that is not just against bureaucracy, but is specifically against the way that professional planners get separated from people on the ground, from local practices, from folk knowledges, the failures on the part of the Bolsheviks to understand some of the wisdom of the peasantry. You know, the whole system there was a lot more complex than they gave it credit for in a lot of cases. But it's not just the Soviets. These equally apply to capitalist societies. Wendell Berry's really good in The Unsettling of America for talking about how the Farm Bill that was put through in 1970s forced everyone to go big or go home.
I remember during the 50s, the outrage with which our political leaders spoke of the forced removal of the populations of villages in communist countries. I also remember that at the same time in Washington, the word on farming was get big or get out, a policy which is still in effect and which has taken an enormous toll. The only difference is that of method. The force used by the communists was military. With us, it has been economic. A free market in which the freest were the richest. The attitudes are equally cruel, and I believe that the results will prove equally damaging, not just to the concerns and values of the human spirit, but to the practicalities of survival.
Wendell Berry is here talking about exactly what James C. Scott is talking about. This impulse to go big, led by bureaucrats, regardless of whether they were socialist or capitalist. In either case, they were participating in what he calls the high modernist attitude, which is that everything can be solved with the right rule book, with the right best practices, with the right training, with the right oversight. There's some really amazing stuff in Seeing Like a State, especially towards the end, as it gets into this idea of practical know-how that is embodied and local, and how it doesn't fit into textbooks. It can't actually be systematized, it can't be turned into a bunch of ironclad laws, but it's instead rules of thumb that require on-the-ground discernment that comes from trial and error. And so, yeah, he uses this to talk about early settlers in the United States, realizing that they didn't know how to plant corn. When they tried to follow the almanacs from England, they were planting too early or too late. The corn wouldn't grow. And so they actually had to learn from the natives who had a rule of thumb. Something like, you don't plant the corn until the oak leaf is the size of the ear of a squirrel. And that even though the oak varieties and squirrel species changed with altitude in different areas on the east coast of the US, this rule stayed the same. It kept working across the different areas. So it was actually a really ingenious insight. It was, you could call it a coincidence, but it worked. This kind of knowledge that people who are rooted in an area, who really know their region, can acquire, he calls metis.
The kind of knowledge required in successful local endeavors is not deductive knowledge from first principles, but rather what Greeks of the classical period called metis, a concept to which we shall return. Usually translated inadequately as cunning, metis is better understood as the kind of knowledge that can be acquired only by long practice at similar but rarely identical tasks, which requires constant adaptation to changing circumstances.
So I say all of this about Wendell Berry and John C. Scott just so that people don't take me for the sort of communist that people often do when they hear about time energy theory. The go-to assumption with time energy theory is that it's some kind of a communistic thing, because it does require large-scale structural change. But what John C. Scott and Wendell Berry are great at is showing, no, like, you have to preserve, care for, and open up the space of the local, build local sovereignty and the ability for people to be able to care for the land themselves. But none of this would matter if it were not for the fundamental critique of capital. So people could say what they want about Marx, but you can't get away from him, because we still live, to some extent, in his world. I think there were a lot of things about his diagnosis, and especially his prescription for society, that were wrong. But we can't even begin to have a serious conversation if you're not going to sit at the big kids' table and think seriously about what he got right.
The simple circulation of commodities, selling in order to buy, is a means to a final goal which lies outside circulation, namely the appropriation of use values, the satisfaction of needs. As against this, the circulation of money as capital is an end in itself, for the valorization of value takes place only within this constantly renewed movement. The movement of capital is therefore limitless. Value therefore now becomes value in process, money in process, and as such, capital. It comes out of circulation, enters into it again, preserves and multiplies itself within circulation, emerges from it with an increased size, and starts the same cycle again.
It's by understanding capital that we are able to separate and differentiate between use value and exchange value, and later through thinkers like Baudrillard, sign value. By being able to tell the difference between these different forms of value, we're able to understand that time energy is itself the fundamental kind of value. And only by centering time energy are we really able to then prioritize use values again. Without prioritizing use value, we will be stuck in the realm of exchange value. This is not just because of the mode of production or the mode of exchange. It's not just because of the base. It's also what Marx would call the superstructure. Timenergy is about breaking this distinction within and between ourselves, short-circuiting the operations of desire and drive, the ideological fantasies that keep this whole thing working, and helping us realize that some things just aren't as valuable as other ways of being. Ways of being is perhaps what this is all about. There are ways of being in the world that work with as opposed to against the world. There's a way of being in the world where being in the world itself is shattered into subject-object relations, where those subjects enframe the world of objects not as mere tools, but as resources on call, served up to satisfy our every short-term whim. This satisfaction-driven life is the opposite of a passion-driven life. This individualistic, hedonistic, modern liberal push, it's a suicidal delirium of a world gone mad. This is where Martin Heidegger's work comes in.
The so-called problem of reality, in the sense of the question of whether an external world is present at hand, and whether such a world can be proved, turns out to be an impossible question. Not because its consequences lead to inextricable impasses, but because the very entity which serves as its theme is one which repudiates, as it were, any such formulation of the question. Our task is not to prove that a so-called external world is present at hand, or to show how it is present at hand, but to point out why Dasein, as being in the world, has the tendency to bury the so-called external world in nullity epistemologically before going on to try to prove it.
My American translation of that is basically philosophers and modern philosophy in general gets focused on trying to prove the world, but it wouldn't do this if it wasn't for the fact that we're the kind of being that is in the world. But it's the way that we're in the world that makes it so that we lose touch with the world, with our being in the world. This way of being in the world that we generally are, he calls falling, which throughout my work I've referred to as the vicious cycle, which we'll come back to.
The reason for this lies in Dasein's falling, and in the way in which the primary understanding of being has been diverted to being as presence at hand. A diversion which is motivated by that falling itself. If one formulates the question critically with such an ontological orientation, then what one finds present at hand, as usually and solely certain, is something merely, quote, inner, unquote. After the primordial phenomena of being in the world has been shattered, the isolated subject is all that remains. And this becomes the basis on which it gets joined together with a so-called world.
I figured if I were to focus on one page from the entirety of Being in Time, I wanted to zoom in on this page in particular. It's page 250 in the Macri and Robinson translation, by the way. I wanted to zoom in on this page in particular, though, because it is only after being in the world gets shattered that Dasein gets reduced to a subject that is in relation to a world of objects. This is a world that gets interpreted as a bunch of things, as opposed to different kinds of beings that belong to different orders of being that are different and distinct from our own kind of being. Once that all gets leveled after the shattering of being in the world, it becomes really easy for us to exploit one another, and especially the earth. Later on in the question concerning technology, Heidegger will talk about this in terms of putting the world on call. Put the world on call, and then in turn, we get put on call. The world gets put on call to satisfy our every whim, to satisfy our appetites, but then we get put on call to satisfy the every whim and appetite of the world economy. Being in Time, a book that I like to reread every couple of years and that I teach at Theory Underground, is about being in the world and how humans, properly speaking, are not just some abstract transcendental subjectivity or some cogito. No, Descartes. No. Kant. We're Dasein. We're the kind of being who wonders the question about being itself. The kind of being that is defined at the level of essence by the fact that it has possibilities, that it can make its purpose, and that this purposefulness is not something meaningful when taken on individually, but only collectively when done so in a deliberate, grounded kind of sense. In order to achieve that, we have to free ourselves from our stupor, from the vicious cycle of ambiguity, non-committal curiosity, and idle chatter. We have to drill back down into our primordial possibilities, our own most possibilities, which is to say, look, I mean, I'm sorry. I know this is like the Heideggerian speak coming through, so I'll just put it this way. Instead of living other people's possibilities in some vague, abstract, non-committal way, we can change our attunement to one that is not just ready, but running out ahead into the bullet storm, saying, you know what, I'm gonna do this. There's something bigger than just me, and I'm gonna take risks. This being unto death, as he calls it, this resoluteness that runs out ahead is the only way that you can seize your true possibilities, which are not yours per se. They go beyond you, they go beyond me, they go beyond the I, they go beyond the us in some vague societal sense, and it gets down to a much deeper rooted sense of who we actually are. Now, that can mean a lot of things. Rootedness can mean a lot of things. What it means to actually be in the world is something that we still have to figure out, because we've all been thrown into a world where we don't know what that means. Theory's not the only way out. We are embodied in the world. Dasein is being there. And part of what that means is we got to figure it out. But we can only figure it out in praxis, by getting after it, by tending to soil, by cultivating our hearts, our souls, our minds, and not just doing so in the niches of the post-class fractured mass on the internet. We actually have to change the world. I think Heidegger and Marx and the bridge between them that is time-energy theory are all essential to that endeavor.
Time-energy is not a category used to classify the world of natural objects or of tools. Time-energy is not for understanding what it is, so much as why and how we are, or what we can be. I and thou, not it. Time-energy is not a scientific category. It is an existential structure of our being in the world. We are all deprived of time-energy. Our society revolves around the commodification, or exchange, of labor power, which is what time-energy becomes in a world based around jobs and consumerism. Time-energy is existentially prior to the economic divorce and separation of time from energy.
Why does it matter to say that time-energy is an existential? Well, this is a term that means something strictly within the context of reading Being in Time, as opposed to an ontological category or a political or an economic category. An existential is something teased out from what happens when we analyze existence only going off the basis of what we can be absolutely certain about. And we can be absolutely certain about the fact that we need large, energy-infused, repeatable blocks of time reliably available within a society to be able to do anything, much less to be able to coordinate our activities, to be able to discover and cultivate our talents, or to nurture our relationships with ourselves, with our children, with our parents, with our grandparents, with future generations, and with the soil. To say that we need to be cultivating, nurturing, and tending to souls and soils and bringing them into a better dynamic with the cycles of nature is to say the task of being human is mediating necessities, contingencies, desires, appetites, and disagreements about ways of doing this. But the task of getting our time energy and the kinds of institutions that can free these up so that we can find, nurture, cultivate our talents under tutelage, T3 institutions, that to do this soul, soil, cycles thing is what it is to be human. To fight for our humanity in the face of an uncertain future. As I argued in my first conversation with Nick Land, when bioengineering and AI and automation are overtaking us and not seemingly freeing us, time energy has to be put at center. But this cannot be done through simple top-down capitalist or communistic administration. Both approaches have assumed that farm work is something that needs to be phased out of existence to the best of society's ability. That farmers need to go big or bust. Both of these approaches are failing to understand there is something noble in this kind of work, just as there is something noble in other callings, such as doctor or philosophy professor or musician. That there are noble callings that even when AI and automation can technically phase us out, we will nonetheless wish to do these things. I think all of the kids across the world playing Minecraft and Stardew Valley and then going to school and getting put on ADHD medications because they can't sit still all day would be better off living on a smaller farm, tending to the earth, listening to audiobooks, living the kind of existence that has been made possible thanks to modern technology and what we now know about how to care for the earth. You know, you're either Christopher Columbus or you're living off of his efforts in the one path. The other path of husbandry, of nature, nurture, natality, it's something else. Wendell Berry in The Unsettling of America says the true line that divides humanity is not oppressor versus oppressed, but is exploiter versus nurturer.
We can understand a great deal of our history, from Cortez's destruction of Tenochtitlan in 1521 to the bulldozer attack on the coalfields 4.5 centuries later, by thinking of ourselves as divided into conquerors and victims. In order to understand our time and predicament, and the work that is to be done, we would do well to shift the terms and say that we are divided between exploitation and nurture. The first set of terms is too simple for the purpose because, in any given situation, it proposes to divide people into two mutually exclusive groups. It becomes complicated only when we are dealing with situations in secession, as when a colonist who persecuted the Indians then resisted persecution by the crown. The terms of exploitation and nurture, on the other hand, describe a division not only between persons, but also within persons. We are all to some extent the products of an exploitive society, and it would be foolish and self-defeating to pretend that we do not bear its stamp.
Part of what I like about breaking away from the conqueror victim dichotomy is that obviously falls into this sort of essentialized identity politics, gatekeeping, oppression Olympics, ridiculousness. Whereas nurture versus exploitation isn't just between groups, but also between you and yourself, right? There's the you that will exploit or be parasitic upon others, and then there's a you that gives back, that builds, that helps, that makes a difference.
Let me outline as briefly as I can what seem to me the characteristics of these opposite kinds of mind. I conceive a strip miner to be a model exploiter, and as a model nurturer, I take the old-fashioned idea or ideal of a farmer. The exploiter is a specialist, an expert. The nurturer is not. The standard of the exploiter is efficiency. The standard of the nurturer is care. The exploiter's goal is money, profit. The nurturer's goal is health. His land's health, his own, his family's, his communities, his country's. Whereas the exploiter asks of a piece of land only how much and how quickly it can be made to produce, the nurturer asks a question what is much more complex and difficult. What is its carrying capacity? That is, how much can be taken from it without diminishing it? What can it produce dependably for an indefinite time? The exploiter wishes to earn as much as possible by as little work as possible. The nurturer expects, certainly, to have a decent living from its work, but his characteristic wish is to work as well as possible. The competence of the exploiter is an organization. That of the nurturer is an order, a human order. That is, that accommodates itself both in other order and to mystery. The exploiter typically serves an institution or organization. The nurturer serves land, household, community, place. The exploiter thinks in terms of numbers, quantities, hard facts. The nurturer in terms of character, condition, quality, kind.
It's easy to say you're against exploitation and then keep saying, oh, but there's no ethical consumerism under capital, and then just be a consumer tourist, saying that there's no other way, that this is just, you're cursed to live this way because this is the essence of language. Here we are in our postmodern morass, right? Or take action and actually do something and make a change. On this whole note about the indigenous ways of life, and especially how that's, the lunatic farmer does talk about it. So, Joel Salatin does touch on that, of course. He does talk about it, but Common Ground builds it up a lot more. And it kind of does it in this race washy way that doesn't think about class really and makes it all about, oh, well, white men this and white men that.
We have to acknowledge that the system of agriculture that we have been operating under has been preferential to white people.
It's what you got to show certain people in your lives, and that's fine. But they're not wrong about certain kinds of indigenous wisdom.
Modern capitalist societies, however richly endowed, dedicate themselves to the proposition of scarcity. Inadequacy of economic means is the first principle of the world's wealthiest peoples. The shortage is due not to how much material wealth there actually is, but to the way in which it is exchanged or circulated. In some native languages, the term for plants translates to those who take care of us. The land is the real teacher. All we need as students is mindfulness. Knowing that you love the earth changes you. To live in a relationship with the world, to be of the world rather than just on it.
My only concern with this approach is that it risks the sort of Rousseauian noble savage and makes it seem like there's Western white people versus the, noble BIPOC. And that's just not accurate. There were exploitative natives and there were nurturant natives. And they were internally divided within tribes and between tribes. So it just doesn't make sense to do this thing that Common Ground does, where they try to frame it as, oh, well, you see, natives, they always knew.
Regenerative ag is actually just indigenous principles.
The thing is every tradition has its wealth that can be learned from and applied to our current situation. What we're talking about is not, as Common Ground frames it, a return to living the way that natives lived, but is respecting certain tenets of certain indigenous philosophies, while at the same time updating them to a world where we'll still get to have the internet and air conditioning units and rockets that can take us to space. What I do like about Common Ground is the emphasis on building back to better than pre-colonial times, something made possible by modern technology informed by ancient wisdom. Thanks to guys like Joel Salatin and methods like polyface farming, we are able to counter and harness tendencies inherent in nature in a way that does not casually write off or dismiss those realities, but is instead realist and conserves the best from the past while laying out a genuine way forward. What does it mean to go from dirt to soil, from dust bowls and runoff and desertification to rich, healthy abundance? What does that mean? Well, we're going to have to find out if we want to create a world that is time energetically rich. Now, that's the thing I want to close out on. I know a lot of people are going to say, but Dave, time energy theory, to have time energy, we have to have automation. And automation is going to do all of the work for us. And then we'll all just live on UBI. No, that's never been what time energy theory is about.
By redistribution of essential labour, of course, I mean that merely being a part of society would require certain chores be done by everyone. Thus, whatever could not be automated would be turned from a full-time job that requires an exploited workforce into mere chores. Essential labour includes dangerous, disgusting and demeaning kinds of necessary labour that must be redistributed if we are to have a society that purports to guarantee equality of opportunity.
So yes, automation is strategically harnessed, but I've never argued for full automation or the abolition of work. I said it a little differently in Timenergy.
Without large, robust, and intelligently designed social institutions that could harness and direct automation, freed up time would be immediately reappropriated to the ends of necessary labor. Only if the majority of absolutely necessary economic functions could be automated and redistributed would the sphere of freedom grow larger.
So that's the part that most anti-work people or full automation people miss, is the redistribution aspect, which is awfully convenient for people who want other people to do the inescapable necessary work. I think it's worth mentioning, and I'll just go ahead and add it, even though this video essay is way too long by internet norms. I'm gonna add one more just to really embellish my point. Slavoj Žižek, in his foreword to my book, Timenergy, wrote,
McKerracher's work is a wake-up call to pseudo-intellectuals everywhere. Workers do not just need higher pay. They also need the large, energy-infused, reliably repeatable blocks of time in their week to take on such tasks as reading. As McKerracher is keen to point out, to achieve time energy will require large-scale structural change that redistributes the labour that cannot be automated.
See, even Slavoj was able to hone in on what I'm saying here.
Time energy is about a kind of freedom more substantial than anything capitalism can provide. It is also implicitly a critique of past alternatives to capitalism. It is a call for new kinds of solutions.
We have to automate the jobs that are ignoble, that are degrading, that are necessary, but not a life worth living. To the extent that we can, ball bearings and valves and the kinds of things that we need everywhere across this planet should be produced in the most efficient ways possible. Yeah, automate that work to the best of our abilities. And then what can't be automated when it comes to that kind of factory production, people should work their part-time. But outside of working their part-time, what is a meaningful life? What is a fulfilling pursuit? Well, I think people would be surprised how many people would love to live a life that is in a much, much closer relation to nature, that touches grass every day, that has feet on soil, that is grounded, right? That doesn't mean everybody has to live that way. Some people are going to be creating rockets, right? Some people are going into space. Some people will be cyborgs. But the true future that opens up is one that is post-progressive versus conservative, and post-natural versus cyborg, and is instead going to lay the symbiotic relation between the two. For those of us who want to stay and sustain the earth, and be the home base for those who are going to take off in the rockets and explore space, we have to figure out a way of having a real alliance between the kinds of people in the lunatic farmer and the kinds of people in common ground. Theory Underground has always been about being beyond left and right, being beyond religious and atheist, and has always been about tarrying with new ways and radical concepts. In Surutu Phase 1, we went to the people across this country and asked them questions in gas stations. We asked truckers, we asked clerks, we asked all kinds of workers, and we compared their answers to the students, faculty, and administration at a university. But that was mostly about deconstructing our own assumptions of what people are like, just giving ourselves an opportunity to get out there and actually meet people. Phase 2 is about going into actually existing and successful communities that are not just consumer niches. Surutu stands for Socioanalysis and Alien Anthropology Research Unit at Theory Underground. Phase 2 is all about going into these kinds of spaces that are very different from our own but are successful, and building connections with people that are doing local organizing. And then we'll have a sort of TU weekly or bi-weekly meeting with you where we do a sort of meta touching grass, where we talk about how the local grassroots organizing work that you're doing is working out. And if you want ideas about what kind of a chapter to start, what kinds of experimental activities to do with other people, or if you're running into problems with your organizing work and you're wondering about how to handle them and you want to consult people who've been doing this kind of thing for over 10 years, TU could be a resource for you. No, we're not just doing this as organizers, though. We're doing this as theorists who are theorizing our praxis. If that's exciting to you and you're excited about doing longer-term experimental planning that will bring people together and with the goals of intergenerational long-term change, get involved today. Thank you. All right, everybody, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your interest, your time, for taking the time to listen this far. If you made it this far, you obviously care or are interested in what's going on here. You probably already are familiar with my work, but if you're not and you're new here, I'm about to tell you about how to get involved, how to access past courses and stuff like that. But I also want to say, if you are interested in helping or getting to know more about the new era of Theory Underground here at the McKerracher Family Farm, there is a sort of soft launch retreat where we are going to recollect, reground, and reproject. The 3R retreat coming up at the end of September. You can reach out to me directly. The sign-up fee is $250, and it's in basically Athol, Idaho. So, if that's something you're interested in, just reach out to hello.theoryunderground@gmail.com. There are limited spots available, and they're going fast. TU is building a studio. I have officially cleared ground. I've been working on it for the last several months, on and off, but am, as of this last week, beginning to get a lot more traction on the project because more money has come in. So thank you so much for those who have already contributed via donations for the TU studio. It's going to happen no matter what, but the question is when. If you want to help speed up the process, make things smoother sailing, and help me keep creating the kinds of content that you love, and even better, the kinds of content that is to come. There's a whole new era getting rolled out. If you want to help make it possible and usher it in smoother and faster, the best way to do that is to make a donation via the Zelle link up on the screen here. You see that QR code? Use that QR code. Once you have an account, that QR code should take you to where you can make the bank transfer with zero charge, which is really sweet, huh? Yeah, we love that. That's why we're using Zelle. Thank you so much for helping make this possible. So I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the past courses and the ongoing courses here at TU. Because if any of them sound exciting to you, well, you can access all of them by becoming a subscriber. That's right, subscribers make all of this possible. Subscribers get access to the course I taught on Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, as well as the course that I taught the first half of last year, Emmanuel Levinas's Totality and Infinity, the second half for which I will be teaching this winter. I've also taught critical media theory and critical doxology and time energy with my wife, Ann Snellgrove McKerracher, who is the co-host on What's Right. Also, you would get access to the course I taught at the university, 3 semesters worth, on Intro to Critical Social Theory and Socioanalysis. But also we've had lots of other great professors teach Introduction to Marxism by Chris Catrone, Intro to Lacan via Seminar 11 with Todd McGowan, Introduction to Ivan Illich with Brian Weeks, The Clinical Structures of Psychoanalysis and Autism with Dr. Leon Brenner, the Michael Downs Seminar, Introduction to Slavoj Žižek, Introduction to Nick Land, and Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do, all taught by Michael Downs, as well as What is Sex? There was a collab that I did with Cadell Last. Theory 101, a collab I did with Hello Gorgias. And then also, of course, there's Carl Jaspers' Is the Idea of the University, PMC Consciousness and Ideology. These were early, very important courses that I taught with friends at TU back in 2023. And they remain important to this day. Every one of these courses comes out of an overarching research project. There's a real driving force, mission, and agenda to the research going on at TU because we want to understand the situation for the sake of large-scale structural change focused on the good life. What does that actually mean? If you really want to go deep, obviously, these courses are something you could spend the better part of a year binging while at work. Ongoing courses that come out on a monthly basis are the Fundamental Problems and Core Concepts at TU with yours truly, also my seminar, Philosophy of Nature with Nina Power, the Benjamin Studebaker seminar, as well as his course, The 12 Political Theorists. We've got some really exciting stuff coming down the line. The only way to make this all possible and really deepen your knowledge and familiarity with all of these different things is to become a subscriber today at http://theoryunderground.com/subscribe. Thank you.